It was a thrilling race in Singapore as the 2023 season form seemed to be forgotten, with Red Bull well off the pace this weekend. It was an awesome event with so many talking points as we saw a glimpse of how close this season could be if Red Bull wasn't there. So here's my 5 things we learned from the 2023 Singapore Grand Prix. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. A strategic masterclass from Sainz. Carlos Sainz became the first winner from outside of Red Bull in 2023, and he brought an end to both the Red Bull and Max Verstappen win streaks. The Ferrari car was incredibly fast around the streets of Singapore, and on a circuit where one lap pace is crucial, this enabled Sainz to take pole position by 7/100ths of a second from George Russell. Unlike Monza, where Sainz also got pole position, the Red Bulls were a long way back, and it looked like it would be his best opportunity to secure a race win, which is exactly what he did. The strategy in Singapore is critical. It's a race which is physically demanding, and every single event hosted here has seen at least one safety car. This means that choosing the right tyre is critical to ensure the drivers can take advantage of a cheap pit stop if the opportunity arises during the right pit stop window. But not only did Ferrari start Sainz on the medium tyre, they also opted for a soft compound tyre for his teammate Charles Leclerc, who started third. This decision enabled Leclerc to have a better launch off the line and then overtake George Russell into turn 1. By this point, Ferrari had command of the race. Track position is key in Singapore, and really from this point it was theirs to lose. Through the first round of pit stops triggered by the safety car for Logan Sargent's trip into the barrier, Sainz just maintained the lead over Max Verstappen. But realistically, the Red Bull was unable to match the pace of the leaders as they had fresh tyres and Verstappen's were aging. From here, Sainz controlled the pace well, but it was in the closing stages that he showed why he really deserves to win this Grand Prix. With both Mercedes gambling at the late virtual safety car to go onto medium tyres while Ocon's car was recovered, the pair were on fresher, faster tyres in the final 20 laps or so. This enabled both Russell and Hamilton to make good progress in hunting down the leaders. They soon got past Charles Leclerc, who seemed to really struggle on the hard compound tyre, falling back from the leaders, and then this chase turned into a four-way battle for the lead over the last few laps. Carlos Sainz knew that the Mercedes cars were on the faster tyre, and so towards the end he was slowing down to ensure Norris got DRS to help him defend from Russell. This tactical driving was some of the best we've seen, and it was a mature drive from the Spaniard. It's impossible to know if he would still have taken the win without giving Norris the DRS, but it's clear his race would have been more stressful in those final laps. It was fantastic to see a team other than Red Bull take the top step of the podium this season, and it was a fantastic performance from Sainz all weekend with a brilliant tactical drive. So for me, Sainz deserves a green box for his performance in Singapore. A disastrous weekend for Red Bull. The team that has been bulletproof all season has been beaten at the 15th race of the year in Singapore. Coming into the weekend, it was a question of how close the other teams could be to Red Bull this weekend, but the Austrian champions struggled to get their tyres up to temperature, which preventing them from being able to set quick lap times. One of the car's strengths in 2023 is the fact that it is incredibly light on its tyres, and the nature of the Singapore circuit being high downforce with lower top speeds seemed to hurt the Red Bull. The team's struggles on Friday were surprising, but most expected Red Bull to find some pace overnight as they worked on setup changes in the simulator. In the end, those expected improvements failed to arrive, and soon after, both Red Bulls dropped out of Q2 for the first time since 2018. This was a huge moment. The team tends to be so strong all weekend, but to fail to even make it into the top 10 at a race that is notoriously difficult to overtake was shocking. Not only this, but Verstappen in particular was involved in several incidents through the qualifying session. This included waiting at the end of the pit lane for too long, which prevented other drivers from getting out onto the circuit. It also included blocking Tsunoda after the team failed to adequately communicate with him regarding the AlphaTauri. And then also another incident where a mass of cars were involved in blocking Logan Sargent's Williams. I was surprised to see Verstappen receive just 2 reprimands for these first 2 events, particularly the Tsunoda infringement, as in previous events those type of infringements, even without team communication, have resulted in penalties. But regardless, the Red Bull drivers would line up 11th and 13th on the grid. In the race, the team went for the counter strategy, going for the hard tyre at the start and then running it for as long as possible before hoping for a late safety car which would allow them to get a cheap pit stop. In the end, the safety car came and gave an advantage to drivers who started on the mediums, which was a shame as the Red Bull strategy could have been even more interesting without that cheap pit stop for their rivals. It meant Verstappen and Perez were sitting ducks following the safety car on older tyres, and they would then have to fight their way back to progress up the order. One of the decisions from Sainz was to slow the pace of the race right down. As a result, there was limited field spread. This again meant that it was difficult for the Red Bull drivers as they would go right towards the back of the order through their pit stops, making it even more difficult to get the counter strategy to work. This made Verstappen's drive back to 5th in the end and just 3/10 off 4th particularly impressive. Even when the car wasn't there for him this weekend, Verstappen was still there to deliver a strong performance and secure some strong points. But Sergio Perez, on the other hand, seemed to have a chaotic race. On the opening lap, he dived down the inside of Tsunoda, which broke his front wing end plate off and left Tsunoda out of the race entirely. Later, he made a similar rookie-esque move on Alex Albon when fighting for 10th, which dropped the Thai driver right down the order. Both moves seemed to be opportunistic and not what you might expect from the driver that was king of the streaks here 12 months ago. Perez did receive a penalty for his move on Albon, but that was still poor considering he ruined the Thai driver's race. Overall, it was a disappointing weekend for Red Bull and one that they would probably like to forget sooner rather than later. Fortunately for them, the Japanese Grand Prix is up next, which should give them an opportunity to get back on the top. Overall though, for their race in Singapore, it's got to be a red box for Red Bull. They failed to match the expectations that their excellent performances have set for themselves in Singapore this year. Before I take a look at some of the other brilliant performances this weekend, I want to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to Behind the Drive. We're working to bring you the best F1 content on YouTube, and to be the first to see it, you should subscribe today. McLaren's upgrades put them back at the front. McLaren's upgrades, just before the summer break, propelled them up the order and enabled Lando Norris to take 2 podium finishes before the break. In Singapore, McLaren brought 9 upgrades once again, the most of any team this weekend. It's impressive to see them bring another upgrade package so soon after the last one in Austria, and it worked wonders for Lando Norris, who managed to finish second for the 3rd time so far this season. The new upgrades were clearly tailored to the high downforce nature of the Singapore circuit, and as a result, Norris came very close to the Mercedes and Ferrari drivers all weekend. Norris kept his race clean, managing to be right on the tail of the Mercedes of George Russell, and then did well to close up to Sainz once the Mercedes pit. It didn't take long for Sainz and Norris to disappear off into the distance, building a gap on Leclerc which was critical for Norris to keep hold of his podium position, as he would get DRS from Sainz towards the end to defend from the faster cars behind him. Norris's race was excellent, and he could have taken the win if he'd been able to make a move stick on Sainz. This would have always been unlikely given they had tyres of similar age, but these kinds of performances show that Norris's first win is surely not too far away. Oscar Piastri was unfortunate to be knocked out in Q1 as he was right behind Lance Stroll's huge crash in the final corner. But despite being in 17th on the grid and not having the upgrades that his teammate had this weekend, he still managed to get the strategy right and fought his way back up to 7th for the checkered flag. This is a huge result, and it was a brilliant first race in Singapore for the McLaren rookie. Performances like this are needed when things don't quite go your way in qualifying, and so it was a strong result for the Australian driver. For me, I think McLaren deserve a green box for this weekend. It was another strong race and they're well in the mix with Ferrari and Mercedes. Liam Lawson deserves an F1 seat full time. Liam Lawson was one of the strongest drivers this weekend in Singapore. The New Zealand driver came into the weekend saying it's one of his favourite circuits, and he delivered at just his second full F1 weekend. The young driver admitted that he perhaps wasn't as physically prepared as the other drivers on the grid, which makes sense as he's had significantly less time to prepare for this weekend, which tends to be the toughest on the F1 calendar. But he didn't let that stop him. In FP3, Lawson had a spin at turn 3, which was a sign that he was finding the limits of his AlphaTauri, but he didn't let that knock his confidence either. Lawson was impressive in qualifying, showing tremendous one-lap pace in that car, which has tended to be the worst on the grid in 2023. Lawson's great Q2 lap knocked Max Verstappen out of qualifying early, which was a shock to say the least. It was amazing to see Lawson as the only Red Bull contracted driver into Q3, which again shows just how disappointing Red Bull were and just how good Lawson was this weekend. These kinds of statements are needed for Lawson to secure a seat on the grid for 2024, and he's making it more and more difficult for Red Bull to turn him away, and I'm sure this advert of his driving will be getting the attention of other teams on the grid. Williams seems to be the only other potential suitor that hasn't confirmed their 2024 driver lineup yet, and I think he would be a great choice there also. In the race, Lawson secured 2 points for 9th position. This is the best result of any AlphaTauri driver this season, and he scored points in the car that De Vries and Ricciardo, albeit with just 2 races, have also failed to score. Yes, the track may have been more suited to the AlphaTauri this weekend, but that can't take away from what was a brilliant performance in Singapore for Liam Lawson. I really hope he becomes a full-time driver in 2024, so it's got to be a green box for this weekend. Mercedes roll the dice and almost make it work. Mercedes have brilliant race pace in 2023 compared to their one-lap pace. This has put them in a good position throughout the season so far relative to the teams around them, but this weekend in Singapore it put them in a difficult position. Track position is key in Singapore, and overtaking is very difficult. But Mercedes gave up track position in Singapore to roll the dice on new tyres, which might have seen them fight back towards the end. Russell dropped from 2nd to 4th, and Hamilton dropped from 4th to 5th, as they decided to fight back towards the end. From there, the team seemed to have made the right call. It looked like Hamilton had done the better job of bringing the tyre up to temperature, and then he had the stronger pace in the end. But it seemed like there was no time to let Hamilton have a go at overtaking Norris with just a few laps to go. I think Mercedes made the right call to try the new strategy, and with 2 or 3 more laps, I think they could have won this race this weekend. Russell's last lap mistake, where he tapped the wall and ended up in the barrier, was disappointing, but it was a sign that he was really pushing to try and get the overtake done. It was a disappointing mistake and it cost him a podium finish, but at least his teammate was there to back him up and take the position. It was a good weekend for Mercedes, and they could have been the best performing constructor this weekend if it wasn't for that final lap error from George Russell, but it was still a good result as they far outscored Aston Martin. On the whole, I think Mercedes deserve an amber box. They did everything right, but Russell's error cost the team. They will be back before the end of the year though. Honourable mentions. Alex Albon came into this weekend with significant scepticism regarding how good the Williams car could be considering the nature of this track. But Albon just missed out on points and he deserved them if it wasn't for Perez's opportunistic move which dropped Albon down the order and gave the Mexican driver a 5-second penalty. Alonso had a dreadful weekend in Singapore. The team was struggling for race pace through the weekend, but Alonso's race included a spin, a slow pit stop and a run to finish last. But regarding Alonso's teammates, F1 safety was on display once again in qualifying as Lance Stroll had a huge incident in the final turn. It was amazing to see the response of the medical teams and the marshals to recover the car, and the fact that Stroll walked away from that incident is just incredible. The final honourable mention has to go to Haas. The team got both drivers into the top 10 in qualifying and secured a single point with Kevin Magnussen. The team split their strategy with the Dane on the 2-stop and he secured the final point once Albon lost out to his incident. So it was a great weekend in Singapore, with competition up and down the order. It showed a glimpse of what could be with F1 this season, and it will be interesting to see if 2023 normality resumes in Japan next weekend.